introduction method for today. So we're going to do blockchain introduction style. I'm going to be the Genesis block. I'll introduce the first speaker, and from here on it will be chained. He will introduce the one after him and the one after him and so forth. So if you're a speaker, look at the program and see who's after you, and be prepared to introduce them. And with this, it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Raj Woman from Northeastern University. Raj is a very well-known researcher in the field of graph theory, compact data structures, machine learning theory, and now, evidently, he's going to tell us about a simpler way to look at consistency of Nakamoto consensus. Raj.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction, Dalia and Elaine, for the invitation to the workshop. So it's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk about analyzing blockchain consistency. Actually, while the talk will be a lot about Nakamoto, it actually covers broadly different blockchain protocols, and I will give a few examples as well at the end. This is joint work with the PhD student Luciana Kiffer and Abi, who is well known in this space. In fact, the slides are largely thanks to Lulu. I have made some edits to it. Most surely all the mistakes would be on those edits. So this is based on work that appeared in CCS 2018. Okay, so I will start with some basics just to set the stage. Everybody is familiar with this, I'm sure, but just to set the stage and some of the notation we will use down the road. Okay, so a blockchain is nothing but, in a naive sense, it's a chain of blocks. What is a block? A block has some transactions or anything else you want to store inside the block. There's a hash, and which allows it to connect. And then there is this notion, which I'll mostly focus on in this talk, about proof of work, which enables you to verify the correctness of the block. So you have a chain of these blocks, and the agents that are involved in this process are connected by some underlying peer-to-peer network, and we will give some assumptions about the model of this network. And there is the blockchain protocol specifies something called the mining rule, which tells you how to add blocks to this chain. Okay. Now, a blockchain by itself, as we are maintaining these, doesn't necessarily have to be a chain, a literal chain. It could be organized, for example, as a tree. The blocks that are being developed could be organized as the form of a tree. And not just a tree, you could imagine blocks being organized in the form of a DAG, where new blocks point to older blocks, and you try to derive a blockchain from this. So in a general sense, you could view this as a DAG of blocks, and we will try to think about this view towards the end of the talk as we try to analyze the consistency of these various kinds of protocols. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is analyzing consistency of blockchain protocols, and in the context of yesterday's wonderful keynote talks, consistency here is referring only to the safety properties of blockchain. The term consistency, there are different definitions of it. We will focus on one definition. It's also sometimes referred to as a common prefix property. There are other properties that you're interested in: chain quality and chain growth referring to liveness, and there is a host of work in this area, including fairly recent work, and one of which you'll hear about from Ren later in the afternoon. So there is a lot of formal framework for analyzing blockchain protocols. There is a host of DAG-based blockchain models, and I've just mentioned a few of these, and there are more coming that I'm sure I've missed in these references. There are studies about specific attacks on consistency, chain quality, and growth. And again, there is a lot of work in this. And what I'm focusing on mostly is proof of work protocols. There is a host of studies on proof of stake protocols with consistency properties. And what I'm going to talk about is a very sort of a framework for analyzing some of these models. And while the ideas are drawn from various past work, including past Seaman and Shalat and Garrick, Yais, and Leonardus, some of these ideas are also implicit in other pieces of work. Okay, so what's the model underlying this? I'm going to put a little bit of notation and highlight which notation is important. So at a very abstract level, we could view a blockchain as a pair of algorithms. This first algorithm is the most important thing for us to remember. This is basically describing the mining rule, the pi. Okay? The term k here represents the security parameter that defines your what level of security you want. There is an underlying predicate that defines the semantics of the underlying blockchain. So this is the mining rule that we will mostly focus on. And this tells you what a node wants to do once given a blockchain that in its view, it outputs the sequence of messages that it sees in this blockchain. So we will mostly not be concerned about this. Our concern is about the first, which is the mining rule. There is an underlying execution environment in which the agents are operating. The environment initializes players, either honest or corrupt, and provides inputs to all parties. Okay? That's the underlying environment. So you have a whole bunch of players. There are, at any point of time, the players are divided into two categories, honest and adversarial. So there are a bunch of honest parties. The honest parties execute the protocol faithfully, and that's the pi protocol. Then there are adversarial parties who are under control of an adversary who can do whatever they want. Okay, so the correct parties are controlled by A. There is and I described this peer-to-peer network that is connecting all these players here. There is an underlying, think of this as a router or a network that is connecting them, which is under the control of the adversary. Okay. Okay. So in a given round, the environment supplies some messages to each of the players, which they are going to add to the blockchain, to the blocks. Then the adversary at this point decides which players should it make as corrupt, which players should it make as, which of the players is corrupt. So the adversary has the full potential. It can inspect the state of every single player, every single honest player. Of course, it knows the state of the corrupt players, and decide to corrupt one or more of them. But there is an underlying limit on how many players that the adversary can corrupt. And here we will generally adopt the assumption that even though we're not going to go into details about this, we are going to adopt the assumption that the fraction of players that the adversary corrupts is less than half.
What's the notion of a round?
So a round is a unit of time in which it's sort of the basic unit of time on which other things are being measured. Okay, so we are going to within a round, a new message can be given to a player. A player can mine a block in a round. So that's the discrete time unit that we are looking at.
Player, how do I determine that I'm in this round or that round?
Okay, so there is an assumption of a synchronous clock. Okay, everybody is synchronized on that, but the delays in the network are not in terms of rounds. I mean, they are in terms of rounds, but they are not corresponding to unit round. Yes.
Is inspecting the state of PI mean that PI can't have private randomness?
Good question. So we assume that the PIs have private randomness.
So you can inspect, but then afterwards you have to stop inspecting, and then it
That's
runs.
correct. Exactly.
But the players are actually not aware of the round, right? The players don't need to know what round they're in.
Correct. Correct. So they don't need, they are not synchronized in a round number or anything like that. They are just synchronized in terms of, they have the common clock, yes.
The reason why not to fix the dishonest players at the beginning, why sort of you add them and you...
Oh, so you could, but that would be a weaker model than this. So here you're allowing the corruption to change over time, if need be. But yes, you could fix all the dishonest players at the beginning. But here you're allowing the adversary the luxury of deciding some other players to become corrupt and making some other players honest.
Recovery become honest again.
No, there is. So good, because we stopped in the middle. So in this example, for right now, so let's see. Sorry. Okay, so the player decides to corrupt, then maybe it has to release some other player and make it uncorrupt. If you want to, so in this situation, if the player is allowed, in this example, the player is given 2 corrupt parties. Yes.
The assumption that once a player is corrupt, there is no going back. For our intent and purposes, in our arguments, that player is corrupt.
No. No. So you can, I think for the, what do you model whether the...
As in, the adversary, the corrupt player has already provided his or her inputs, which may have been tainted by the adversary. Now we are saying that player is uncorrupt. What do we do about his or her previous inputs? How do we incorporate that into the security argument?
So, okay, so here we are the way we are modeling this is we have a total of n players in the system. Okay, so when I mean an uncorrupting a player, that means in order for the system to have the required number of corrupt and uncorrupt players, the adversary has to allow the addition of a new uncorrupt player. Okay, so this means, so imagine a system in which the number of players, the set of players playing could change over time, right? So if a corrupt player is being included in the system, then and you have a certain bound in the number of corrupt players, then the adversary has the system for our bounds to hold needs to allow the addition of an uncorrupt player into the system.
Oh, so the player.
It's not the notion. It's not. There is no notion of exactly. Yeah.
Question.
Yes. Yes.
What are the inputs in this case?
So the inputs are basically the messages that are going to be formed in the blocks.
Transactions.
Yes, the transaction.
Including the full history for newly joined.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, for newly joined nodes. Okay, so there was this aspect of identifying how to connect the blocks together using hashes, and then there is the aspect of determining whether a block is valid. So for this, we use a pretty standard the random oracle model, but it's an assumption. So here, the random oracle provides 2 functions, a hash and a verification. In any round, so this is one of the features of why this notion of a round. In each round, every node has access to 1 call to the hash function. Okay, 1 call to the hash function, but an unlimited number of calls to the verification function. Okay, so the verification function just to verify whether blocks are fine. And the same thing applies for the adversary with a relaxation. The adversary controls some number of players. So the adversary can make that many calls to the hash function. And if need be, the adversary can make those calls sequentially. But the adversary can make any number of verification calls just like anybody. Because the adversary doesn't need to. Okay, so you have a Q here stands for how many corrupt players does the adversary control, that many hash functions calls it can make, and then you have the verification. So the underlying assumption here is that, okay, the best way to mine a block is to hash and check. So in every round, you make a call to the hash, and you check, and with certain probability, you will succeed. We will talk about the probability shortly, but you can verify blocks without having to use their hash code. Okay? Any questions about? Good. Okay. So here are sort of a high-level picture of what's going on. The adversary has dynamic control of who to corrupt and corrupt. It has a full view of all on its states. It can make certain number of sequential queries depending upon how many players it corrupts at every round to the hash. It can to the random oracle. It can reorder receipt of honest blocks. It can delay receipt of honest blocks, and I'll talk a little bit about it just now, up to some amount. We follow a model that should be called the non-lockstep synchrony. In a paper, we actually refer to as partial synchrony, but it's been pointed out that's not the right term. So non-lockstep synchrony. So basically what's going on here is that we assume that there is a network delay of delta rounds, which means that within a delta period, honest blocks need to be delivered to each of the things mined by the honest players need to be delivered to each of the honest players.
Yes. So what happens when a node gets uncorrupted? The adversary forgets what the node.
So the way when a node think of this as a new node. Okay. Yes. So the adversary doesn't have control over that.
Right. And the nodes have identities and stuff, and they will fix stuff.
Yes. Yes.
So if there is no notion of a clock, how can you count rounds? What is delta counted in?
So there is there is no notion of clock within the context of a node, but there is a notion of a clock. The way we are analyzing this, time is organized into one number of rounds, and we are stipulating that the adversary has to deliver blocks to honest players within delta rounds.
If an honest node knows he can make Q queries to the hash function in a round, can't he just make as many as he can, and when he's done, he knows the round has finished? Or
No. The honest player. So the honest player can make one query. In each round, can only make one query to the hash function.
Make a second one, he just doesn't get an answer, or is how?
So if he tries to, imagine that you're making sequential queries. It takes one round for the answer to come back.
But then I know that when the answer has come back, one round consistently for everyone has passed. So I can use this to synchronize, no?
You could, if you want to devise a protocol like that, yes. Yes.
Why don't you, if you have a delta network delay,
Yeah.
why don't you forget the network delta delay and say that the system is synchronous,
Okay.
lockstep,
Yeah.
and good messages are delivered by the end of the round, and you don't change the number of players. You just say, at one round, the adversary can corrupt, and another round it doesn't corrupt. Now we have authentication notion based on public cryptography, so this doesn't make sense to us. There is a task to make sense of this, but this will be the right model. I struggled with the same problems and didn't solve it by saying new members and stuff like this. This is ugly.
Okay. Okay. So the one reason is we are actually going to look at how delta relates to.
If you say delta and by the time delta are delivered, why don't you say just synchronous only, that you have this bad guy that can run around all the time? This is
Okay.
This is the notion of asynchrony, really.
Okay. Okay.
My 2 cents on that is because Raj is trying to analyze Nakamoto consensus. Nakamoto didn't design the protocol in a round-based way, so he has to
But
work
he's
with
using Nakamoto. You have to justify how you go from this to Nakamoto. But this is another issue.
The analysis can make the round infinitesimally small because he's trying to be faithful to the protocol. So if you take the round to be infinitesimally small, it's like somewhat safer to the protocol without the difficulty.
Okay, the point, it doesn't really matter what the model is. Like the model allows a lot of extra features, but the protocol doesn't use them. So he's analyzing a protocol that doesn't do all these things. So
we are not making the, right. So the point is that the model is not being designed to develop a protocol. The model is being designed to analyze a given protocol. So we are not going to we're not going to try to synchronize using this model or any other aspect. We are just going to look at the underlying protocol and actually a bunch of different protocols and trying to see whether we can analyze within the context of this model. Okay, so round being the smallest unit of time, there is the network delay bound. There is so one thing I should emphasize here once again is that the adversary can withhold any adversarial blocks for any length of time. Those are not required to be delivered. But okay, so these are the parameters we are going to look at. The network delay bound, the difficulty of mining given by this probability P, and actually we will capture it by the parameter C, which is a common way to do it. This is the mining hardness is expressed in the parameter C, roughly the expected number of network delays before some block is mined. The adversarial fraction of parties and the fraction of honest parties. Okay, so rho and 1 minus rho. Okay, so blockchain consistency. So what we are interested in is the notion of consistency, and there are the notion of consistency that we follow is due to Pass, Seaman, and Shalat, which is also equivalent to the Gare-Kias-Leonardo's common prefix property. So the idea is simply the following, that for any, we basically want two honest players to have consistent chains. But at any point of time, they may have different views. So the way it is, they share a common prefix. Alternatively, the way it's stated is for any two rounds r less than r prime, and you have any two players I and j. I is honest at time r, j is honest at time r prime. The chains of I and j agree on all but the last t records of I. Okay? So up until this point, this fully agrees. After this, we don't know. So t is some bound that we will also try to analyze. Okay, so what I'm going to show you just as an example of what kind of analysis we are trying to get. So here is trying to capture what adversary fraction can the protocol, so in particular the Nakamoto protocol, withstand for a given block time in terms of network delay. Okay, so recall the mining hardness is given by this probability. So the early work of Pass, Seaman, and Shalat gave these two bounds. So this is the consistency bound. By this consistency bound, this basically is the lower bound. That means provably, if you have, let's say, this value of C, then provably with high probability, with high probability, you can withstand almost a half adversarial fraction, regardless of the kind of attacks you can imagine. On the other hand, if you focus on a particular kind of attack, which has been analyzed often, what's called the delay attack, you can withstand a higher fraction of the adversary against that particular kind of attack. So with our analysis that I'm going to try to introduce, okay, so let me say before that. So just to put this in context, for example, for Bitcoin, 60, the value of C is 60, because that's basically the block time. That's how the mining hardness is set in terms of the C value in terms of the network delay. So at this level, we basically see that it can withstand roughly almost a 50% fraction of the adversary. On the other hand, if you look at other blockchains, notably Ethereum and some of the other blockchains that have pretty low values of C, they are operating in a regime where there are, at least if you look at this particular picture, there are virtually no guarantees.
But Ethereum chops off many more blocks than Bitcoin, so the graph will change if you change that parameter.
If you change the,
Ethereum finalization parameter is 300.
Okay.
You chop off 300 blocks.
oh, the value of the t, the value of t that you're saying. But no, I don't think that should have an impact on that, because the consistency is for some value of t. But this is just a bound. If you can get a better bound than this, but the position in the plot will not change. Yes?
I understand you can easily get the block time for Bitcoin and Ethereum, but how do you know what delta they assume?
Yes, so we're making an assumption here. Yes, absolutely right, yes.
About delta. So is that a stochastic time of propagation, or is it by delta everyone has the message?
In this model, it's a deterministic time. Everybody has the message. This is sort of an upper bound on the time it can take.
And the adversary can choose independently for every particular honest party
Yes.
how long one given message is going to take,
And
as long as it's below delta.
that's right.
Okay. And you assume that how does the delta parameter talk about the communication between honest players?
So the communication is all happening through this underlying network. So delta is, so when a player wants to inform about a block, imagine it is sending to this network, and then the adversary controls how that information is going to each of the other players at what time, and the order in which it can be received.
I see. This is sorry. So yeah. So that's. I mean, it's not.
Sure.
This is not what's happening in the real network, right? So there's no adversary that can actually have up to delta delays on everything that's being exchanged on the network. Quite the opposite. I think empirically, the Bitcoin miners, the big miners, the big mining pools talk to each other very quickly.
Yeah.
So you have so delta is putting an upper bound on how strong the impact of the attacker is on the network.
Yeah.
But he still has a lot of power here in terms of communication.
Good. So the one reason we are looking at this sort of this, you could say, putting this condition, is that we are really looking at lower bounds on consistency. So we want to be able to make a guarantee that regardless of worst case properties, we can have this thing. So this does not capture perhaps a typical scenario, but it is trying to put a lower bound in each case, the lower bound against this attack, lower bound against all kinds of attacks under this model, and so on. So that's the main reason why, and the other reason is it simplifies life in terms of the analysis. Yes?
I just want to clarify, so like the 60 number is from a measurement study that was done in 2013 for Bitcoin, which measured like the 90%, the study was done by Christine Decker and his co-authors, and then they showed the 90 percentile delay was 10 seconds back then. But since then, the network structure of Bitcoin has changed dramatically. So this, and I think if you are using the same number for Ethereum, that's probably a misrepresentation, because Ethereum has a different network and have different block size.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And also the miners are very close to each other. And there's a corona of little nodes around, and they have a delay. I mean, so I'm just saying, I understand the mathematics.
That's okay. That's
going to come. And I understand why you're saying this, but maybe there's more sophisticated maths to do with a more realistic model of what the attacker can do on the peer-to-peer layer.
Okay. Okay. So all right. So these plots indicate these plots are correct. In terms of the numbers that are listed here, whether the numbers are correct for the respective protocols is debatable. But okay, so the thing that we would like to extract is using a more careful analysis, using similar ideas as has been done before. Using a more careful analysis, we can get tighter bounds, and these are not the tightest bounds, but we can get tighter bounds. So what I'm going to try to do in the remaining 15 minutes of the talk is give you a glimpse of how these things can be done. So at the highest level, what we are providing is the Markov-based method for analyzing consistency. I'd like to show you that it's a very simple methodology, and the value of it is, in some cases, we can get better bounds than were known before. There will be maybe a more tighter bound presented later this afternoon. But the value of it is that using that framework, you can really analyze a host of different things. You can analyze the consistency of other protocols. You can analyze a family of delay attacks. You can also analyze some other performance metrics you might be interested in, not consistency. You might be interested in how long does it take, like the number of blocks. So what should you keep as the confirmation time for a given transaction? So we can get some analysis for that as well. So I'll try to give you a glimpse of all of this. So start by overview of how we approach the analysis of consistency. Then I will quickly go over steps. Okay, so at a high level, the question is, why does the Bitcoin work the way it works? Again, when I say work here, remember that our analysis will be probabilistic. Okay. So at a very basic level, what's going on is let's assume that everybody is consistent at this point, and there is a period when nobody succeeds this mining, and everyone has the same blockchain with block A at the top. Somebody goes ahead, Bob finds a block B and broadcasts it. And block B is transmitted over the network to all other miners, and let's say this is the delta period of time. Miners get it at various points of time. And at that point, if everybody is here, then at this time, if nothing else of interest happens, all miners have received B. They now begin mining using B as the previous block. Okay, that's the good case. But of course, in the middle, Alice finds a block C and broadcasts it. And now block C is being transmitted over the network, and since, as we assumed, that there could be different delays within the network, some players get to know about B, while other players get to know about C, so there is a fork here. Okay, all right? So, of course, it can happen again and again. So there is E extends B, D extends C, F extends C, and so on. So what prevents forking ad nauseum? And this is where the relationship between the network delay versus mining hardness comes. So naturally, the harder you make mining, the less likelihood of this happening relative to the network delay. Okay, so if you have a hit, what we call a hit, by an honest player, and then you have within a network delay, and the next hit happens much later, that allows you a greater chance of consistency. So this is what we refer to as a convergence opportunity. You have a period of time when network delay, when no block was mined, followed by a period of an individual hit, a single hit, followed by a period of network delay when no block was mined. Yes?
When you want to hang it on delay, why not say that it depends on the probability and on how hard the work is. There is some probability that two will succeed,
yeah.
And then there is an adversary
yeah.
that can deliver to some this guy and can deliver to the other this guy. Not necessarily why hang. Nakamoto is delay, but why hang it when you want to analyze it? You don't have to stay. You are not literal. You don't have to go by the hang it on probability. Hang it on an adversary causing this forking.
I'm complaining it's not realistic enough, and he's complaining it's too realistic.
No, so I don't. Can you explain again? No.
Too realistic is not that good.
I understand.
Good when you do modeling. It may not be that good when you do the modeling because it's actually. So,
okay, I don't have an immediate answer. I'll take that question offline. I think in terms, so one of the reasons we look at convergence opportunity, of course, this is concept that was given by Parseman and Shalit, as well as Gare, Kiais, and Leonardos, who called it differently. But the point about this identifying such what I call a combinatorial object in this sequence is that this guarantees, if this exists, this guarantees that the chains are consistent. Now, you could adopt, instead of talking about delays, instead of talking about this delta, you could try to come up with a different definition. And perhaps that would be more suitable in different context. OK, so delta rounds where no one mines. Everyone hears about all blocks. One player mines a block. Another delta rounds where no one mines. Everyone agrees the block that was mined was the end of the longest chain. Now, this has to happen over honest players. Okay, so no honest players mines. One honest player mines a block, another delta round. So we separate the honest players, and this is what we think of as what's going on. So in order to break consistency, the adversary must break all convergence opportunities. Because the moment there is a convergence opportunity, everybody is agreed on the longest chain at that moment. So that is essentially giving us the lower bound that we are seeking. Okay, so the task basically boils down to how do we count the convergence opportunities. Then we will count how many blocks does the adversary mine, and then we will compare. So let's look at a round R. Let's look at a round R plus T. And during this period, there could be a bunch of different hits separated by silent periods of at least delta rounds. And this gives us rise to a bunch of convergence opportunities. And for an adversary to kill all of those convergence opportunities, the adversary has to come up with hits. And we count the expected number of convergence opportunities, and we compare with expected number of blocks the adversary can mine. One of the challenges in counting the convergence opportunities is that they could be spaced arbitrarily, right? So it's difficult because the spacing between these two might be less than delta and so on. So this is where Markov chains prove to be a convenient way of capturing this, and because as we will see, it's useful enough that you can get other interesting properties from out of it.
Right? So do you take into consideration the fact that if the adversary gets a hit outside, your convergence window, the miners under the control of the adversary are colluding.
Yeah.
Even though they have a better, longer, earlier chain, they might switch to the new chain.
Yes.
You're taking that into consideration?
Yes. When you, in the general consistency bound, if you are looking at specific attacks, if you want to model a specific kind of attack, then so for example, one of the attacks that we try to model is a delay attack, where we assume that the adversary delays everybody by delta units. Okay, so there is a specific strategy, but for the general consistency bound, yes, all kinds of strategies are valid. Okay, so here is a very simple Markov model of convergence opportunities. So there is two states here. The first state is the what we call the messy state. This is a state where hits are happening at a more frequent rate than delta. At some point, there is a delta delay. At that point, it moves to state S1. And then, if there is a hit followed by a delta period, then you have identified a convergence opportunity. Otherwise, you've gone back to the messy state. So this simple Markov chain captures what's going on. So if you can look at this Markov chain and identify how much time or what fraction, given over a period of time, what fraction of the time it's spending here, that gives you a bound in the convergence opportunities. So this is it's a standard Markov chain. The only difference is that notice that each of these edges has certain lengths. So this is the length. This is delta rounds. This has a length which is a random variable. Similarly, this has a length that is a random variable. So analyzing this is a little bit more effort, more work than a very traditional Markov chain. Sometimes this is referred to as a generalized Markov chain, but it's not that much more complicated to analyze. So a program simply is you define a Markov model with states and events of interest. Then you compute stationary distribution for the states and the edges. And these are standard using difference equations. You can go ahead and compute that. Then you derive expectations for the events of interest. In this case, we are interested in convergence opportunities. So we get an expected number of bound for the convergence opportunities. And then you apply concentration theorems. There are lots of well-known Chernoff-Hubding bounds for generalized Markov chains. And to argue, assuming certain conditions hold, to argue that they are concentrated around the expectation. So this high-level framework enables us to analyze a variety of consistency bounds, general driver bounds, as well as specific attacks, confirmation times for different protocols. So to give you an example, for Nakamoto consistency, we get a statement such as this. This is a bound that comes from convergence opportunities. This is a bound that basically, that's the number of blocks that the adversary can mine, as long as there exists delta greater than 0 such that this happens. We get with probability that is exponentially small in k and in t, we would get consensus. So in the next 2 minutes, let me just quickly talk about something, sort of more things that can be done with this model. So one attack that has been often studied is the Nakamoto delay attack, which is basically the specific attack in which the adversary decides that they will do a delay receipt of all honest blocks by delta. Yes?
Go back to previous.
Sure.
What are these PEI?
Sorry. So these are all, this variable is the probability that a certain edge is taken in the Markov chain. This is the stationary probability. Lij is the length of time, expected length of time it goes from a certain state to another state.
And these you just compute based
So
on
these can be computed using formulas such as this. So these can be computed. Looking at the Markov chain, you can get closed form formulas for all of these, and you just plug in those numbers in there.
Sorry, you just have pi I here, you don't have pi ij, so what's pi I?
Yeah, I didn't describe that. So pi, there is a stationary probability for every node. There is also a stationary probability for every edge.
And does this beat the previous one in all parameters, or?
For the low values of C.
Okay, and the high values?
And as far as I see, they are very close.
Because here you're using these concentration bounds from Markov chains, which I assume must be less tight than normal Chernoff bounds, right?
No, they are no, they are as tight. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I will go through. I'll just maybe I'll just stop with this. So just to give you an example of what can be done. So let's suppose you're interested in this delay attack. So you have a state S0, which represents 2 chains of equal length. So the adversary is trying to fork. So you have 2 chains of equal length. If there is a hit, then the honest chain is ahead by 1 block. And if there is a convergence opportunity, then we have reached the point where we have a successful consistency. On the other hand, the adversary could be lucky and could move could move and make a bigger and bigger chain. Okay, so and then with the adversary, so the adversary could be ahead by mining its own private chain. So the real question is how long? So this Markov chain, how long does it take before we reach this state? That's the question, and that's like the block confirmation time. So analyzing this chain requires more effort. So for a given k, we can actually calculate a closed form formula, determine difference equations that give the stationary distribution. We can actually write generating functions whose coefficients are relevant probabilities, solve the recurrence, and then derive the formula. Okay. I'll just show you this plot, and I think I'll end the presentation. You can actually get different kinds of confirmation time, length of fork bounds for different adversaries. Okay. So I'm out of time, so I will go on to just leave this slide here, indicating that we can do something, and we are hoping to do more. So thank you.
I think I'll allow questions only until David walks in, because we're out of time, but
David?
is he here?
There.
Just walk in. All right, no questions. Questions at the break. Let's continue right away.
Okay. So now I'm supposed to mine the next block.